Science. What is science? Anybody understand the science? I'm sure everyone think he or she does understand. Well, I will challenge you, see if you do understand science. Project of science. So we treat science as a project. In business project, what you do first is BRD, Business Requirement Document. In this case, is a definition of science to specify what are the requirements for something to be science. Once the requirements done, you go to R&D and design and develop and implement the requirements in the form of a model of science. And lastly, you conduct the testing, but what you need is standard or criteria to conduct a test against requirements to be able to say, yes, it meets all requirements for science, therefore it's science. No, it's not science because it failed to meet all the requirements. Clear? Now, back to the question, what is science? Well, you have to ask, what is required for science? What are the requirements? There are two pillars. One is definition of science. What it does is to define all the requirements and conditions to be met for something to be science. That's like a BRD. Second, you have to have a scientific standard. It's a criteria to determine what is science, what is not science. For definition of science, there are three pieces that are important for the requirements. The first one is purpose. What's the purpose of science? Did anyone ever ask yourself, what's the purpose of science? It's the most important question for anything to be science. Second, scope of science. And third one is, what is the method that required for everything that is called the science? Every single science have to meet the same, use the same method. Then you need to have a scientific standard for science to tell and determine what is science, what is not science, based on the requirements, if they meet or not. Let's take a look at the existing definitions of science from the West. We pick two, Google AI and Wikipedia. All other definitions of science are similar. So all of them you can see here is qualitative, subjective. You cannot tell what is the requirement for the purpose or what is the purpose. You don't know here. You can tell what's the scope subjectively. It's a physical world in the first one, and the universe second one. It's natural world. But there are a whole lot of more than that. Third, the method. You don't see anywhere it say, okay, has to be quantitative method. Even though you know all natural sciences are quantitative description of interaction of nature, but that's not the case in social science. Now let's look at what's the problem for those Western definitions of science. Subjective. Everything is subjective. So it's a subjectivity risk. You look at the definition, three requirements. First, purpose. It doesn't tell you what is the purpose. You cannot tell what is the purpose of science. You do see a subjective scope, physical or natural world. There are a whole lot more than that. The method, it does not say it need to be quantitative method for all sciences, then you don't see any standard anywhere. So you define science. How do you test what is science, what is not science? You need to have a standard, and you cannot find any single scientific standard for science anywhere in the West. So what does tell you in those two definitions and other definition of science is testing or experiment. But the question is, what's the purpose of testing and experiment? It doesn't tell you, right? From natural science, you know, is testing the accuracy of quantitative description. So it's all about quantitative accuracy. But there is a difference between quantitative description and scientific description. There is difference between quantitative characteristic and scientific characteristic. That's very important understanding and was never understood before. So we're going to come to this point many times in future videos. Now, what's the solution to mitigate subjectivity risk? So objectivity control. So we'll look at one by one. For the purpose, what is the purpose for science? We're saying no matter what the content of science is, it has to be a science equal and fair for everyone and all beliefs of science. Is that fair? The scope. We're saying scope should cover or should include everything, no exception. We're going to see this is very important because anybody suggests anything to be excluded, we're saying it's violation of human rights. We'll come to this point many times. The method, that's simple. Quantitative methods cross all sciences. There should be no exception. Otherwise, it's no longer science. Standard. Basically, it's a criteria for testing anything to be science based on whether they meet requirements for science. So those are the requirements we have to capture in models. This is what science does, right? Everything described by a model. So we'll look at the definition for the requirements and the model to accomplish those requirements of science. First, for definition, we present here a very simple, compact, objective definition that captures all the requirements. That definition of science is a quantitative description of everything, equal and fair for all beliefs to be tested and validated by scientific standard for science. Now, this is very important because even though it's a very short description, you can see all three requirements, quantitative method captured, scope of everything captured, purpose for all captured, and scientific standard captured. So this is very important because this definition will allow you to check and tell what is science, what is not science. That's the difference. So objective. Now, once we have definition, we're going to develop all the models to accomplish what is defined in the definition of science. The first most important model is model of purpose. That is model of all beliefs. Second, model of scope. That's simple. Include everything in scope for model inputs for the model of science. Nothing should be excluded. Model of method, that's also simple to describe but difficult to accomplish. It's a quantitative description of everything, not just interaction of nature, but also interactions of humans. Lastly, model of standard. We need to have a scientific standard for science that itself independent of any political belief. So for first model, that is model of purpose, the requirements, there are two pieces. The first one is all beliefs. So we have a model of coexistence of all beliefs. That's the first model to accomplish the requirement of all beliefs. Second, the equality and fairness. We have a model of neutrality of all beliefs. Combine those two, it's a combined model of neutral coexistence of all beliefs to model the equality and fairness for all beliefs. Scope of science. The scope relatively easy and to include everything, but in particular include nature. Science of nature is pure mathematics, and interactions of nature. Science of interaction of nature is physics and other natural sciences. Then interaction of humans. This is difficult one, right? It should be science of interactions of humans. Social science right now dominated this space. The problem is social science is not quantitative description of interactions of humans. Number one. Number two, it doesn't include a whole lot of other things that should be included in the scope of science. And lastly, unified science of interactions of nature and humans. So that's the scope. Now, for this video, we just want to check is there any science or science definition of science, scientific standard of science exist anywhere in the West. Well, we found there is no objective definition of science that specify all the requirements for anything to be science. You don't have a definition of science. All you have is subjective description you call definition of science. Doesn't help you to differentiate what is science, what is not science. Also, we don't find any scientific standard for science in the West. Everyone can go out there to challenge me to see if you can find any definition of science that is objective description of science or any scientific standard for science. For that reason, we say we don't find any science from existing science because we don't have the tools to tell what are the requirements, what are the standards to differentiate science from what is not science by all the requirements. That's the conclusion for this video, and you're going to see, we're going to prove in future video, there is no science in the West. That's the most stunning discovery, right? Of course, has to be very specific. There is no science in the West that meet simple criteria or requirements of science that is equal and fair for all beliefs and everybody. Thank you.